On an ordinary August afternoon in 2003, a pizza delivery guy named Brian Wells walked into a bank with a cane, a lollipop, and a bomb strapped around his neck. By the end of the day, he was dead. The FBI was chasing clues across Pennsylvania, and a frozen body was about to pop out of someone's basement. The story has it all: a scavenger hunt with deadly stakes, a woman whose boyfriends keep mysteriously dropping dead, and a mastermind, or maybe a pawn, at the center of it all. It's one of the most bizarre, twisted true crime cases you've never heard of. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll be questioning every detail. But before we get into that story, if you like your true crime brief and bingeable, you found the right podcast. I give you at least 2 episodes per week, so hit that follow button now, and welcome to 10 Minute Murder. Brian Douglas Wells was, by all accounts, the human equivalent of a reliable clock. 46 years old, a pizza delivery man with a decade-long tenure at the same pizzeria, and a guy who didn't just show up. He always showed up. He never called in sick. He was late exactly once, and that was because one of his cats died. A valid excuse, really, because those cats are pretty much his whole world. He lived alone in a small apartment with 3 of them, sticking to a routine so predictable you could set your watch by it. Each day, he'd wake up, grab breakfast at a local cafe, read the newspaper, and head to work. Then repeat, day after day. Same breakfast, same paper, same pizza joint. It wasn't flashy, but it was Brian's life. Simple, uncomplicated. Until it wasn't. August 28, 2003 began like any other day for Brian Wells. He got up, went to work, and then made a stop at the bank. He walked in with a cane and a white envelope in hand. When his turn came, he slid the envelope across the counter to the teller and stood there, calm and waiting. The teller read the note, looked up at Brian, and noticed him gesturing towards something under his shirt collar. Whatever it was, it convinced her not to argue. Following the instructions in the note, she emptied her till, handing over everything she had. It wasn't the $250,000 Brian was asking for. It was just $8,000. But Brian didn't complain. He nodded, smiled, took a lollipop from the counter, and walked out the door as if it were just another transaction. It was only after Brian drove off that the teller informed everyone that she had just been robbed. But this wasn't your average robbery. The cane Brian carried was actually a shotgun disguised to look harmless. And under his collar was something far more alarming: a bomb strapped tightly around his neck. The teller had seen it herself and knew that resisting was not an option. The $8,000 wasn't even close to the amount Brian demanded in the note, but he left without making a scene, as if the job was done. Of course, if this were a typical bank robbery, that might have been the end of it, but nothing about this case was normal. This was only the beginning. It took police 2 hours to find Brian Wells, but when they did, things went from strange to downright baffling. Brian didn't deny robbing the bank. Instead, he showed them a bomb strapped tightly around his neck and calmly explained that he was being forced to do it. According to Brian, he'd been sent on a delivery to an address on Peachtree Street earlier that day, where 3 men ambushed him at gunpoint. They strapped the bomb to his neck, and they handed him a series of instructions and gave him the worst to-do list ever created. The rules? Simple. Follow the trail of clues exactly, collect pieces of the combination to the bomb's lock, and eventually, if everything went perfectly, remove the device and live. If Brian strayed from the plan, boom. Took too long, boom. Called for help, entered the wrong code, or looked at the thing sideways, boom. The letters led him all over town on what can only be described as a determined scavenger hunt. Each stop either giving him another piece of the combination or further instructions. One of those stops, naturally, was the bank. But by the time the police found him sitting on the side of the road, the treasure hunt had hit a dead end. Brian was calm, eerily so. But even the most patient man would have his limits. Eventually, he broke the silence to ask the police a very reasonable question. Were they planning to get the bomb off of him or just stand around swapping theories? The police assured him the bomb squad was en route, and it was. Just not fast enough. Almost as soon as the words left their mouths, the device started beeping. Seconds later, it detonated, leaving a gruesome scene and Brian dead. What was left in the aftermath was chaos. While one team of investigators stayed behind to process the scene, a job no one envied, another team picked up the letters and continued the hunt, retracing Brian's steps. They followed the clues one by one, hoping to piece together the rest of the combination or, at the very least, find answers. Instead, the trail fizzled out. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Brian was never supposed to survive. The instructions seemed designed to buy just enough time for the bomb to do its job. As for that address Brian had been sent to earlier, it wasn't an address at all, just the TV transmission tower location. No clues there, no suspects, no nothing. And just like that, the case went cold. Brian Wells was left as the victim of a robbery, kidnapping, and murder so bizarre it sounded more like a movie script than real life. But for the police, there were no credits rolling, just more questions and no one to answer them. About a month after Brian Wells' death, the police received a phone call that cracked open the case in the strangest way possible. On the other end of the line was William Rothstein, a high school shop teacher with a guilty conscience and, apparently, no concept of subtlety. Rothstein calmly informed the authorities that he had been involved in a murder. Specifically, he had helped cover up the death of a man named James Roden. And where is James now? In Rothstein's freezer. That's right, Rothstein had stored Roden's remains in his basement freezer, and the guilt had been eating him alive. So much so, in fact, that he'd written a suicide note. That note, however, ended up being a strange twist in its own right, as it opened with a very bold disclaimer. This has nothing to do with the Wells case. Naturally, this screamed to the investigators, this absolutely has everything to do with the Wells case. The note expressed Rothstein's remorse over James Roden's death, but was oddly insistent that he felt no such guilt about what happened to Brian Wells. Strange coincidence, right? Then there was the matter of Rothstein's address, Peach Street, the same location where Brian had allegedly been ambushed and the bomb strapped around his neck. Suddenly, investigators found themselves with two bodies, one freezer, and a rapidly multiplying number of questions. The most pressing, of course, what was the connection between Rothstein, the body in the basement, and Brian Wells? Rothstein was quick to explain. He insisted that he had not killed Roden. His only crime, he claimed, was agreeing to help conceal the body. A request from a woman named Marjorie Deal Armstrong. Who was she? According to Rothstein, Marjorie was Roden's murderer. And, as investigators would soon discover, she had a backstory as wild and messy as the case itself. Marjorie Deal Armstrong wasn't just William Rothstein's ex-fiancée. She was the kind of ex you don't want to stay in touch with unless you enjoy chaos. And chaos was Marjorie's specialty. Her track record included a long history of mental illness, hoarding tendencies that bordered on legendary, and a curious pattern of men in her life dying under mysterious circumstances. She once shot and killed a boyfriend, successfully arguing self-defense. That set the tone for her relationships going forward. Her husband and several other men she'd been involved with didn't fare much better, including James Roden, her most recent partner. But when James ended up dead, Marjorie didn't just shrug it off and move on. She turned to her old pal William and asked if he could store James's body in the freezer, like leftovers you weren't quite ready to deal with yet. William agreed, because apparently his boundaries were as fragile as his moral compass. But when Marjorie allegedly suggested that he go one step further and grind up James's remains in an ice crusher, even William had to draw the line. Instead of diving headfirst into that nightmare scenario, he called the police, thus opening the door to a whole lot of questions about James's death and whether Marjorie had something to do with Brian Wells also. The connection wasn't immediately obvious. William was a mechanic and an engineer, making him the kind of person who could design a bomb like the one strapped to Brian. But his motive? That was a harder sell. Why risk it all for a bank heist when hiding one body had already pushed him to the brink of a nervous breakdown? As it turned out, Marjorie was the missing link once again. She needed cash, not just for the usual bills, but to hire a hitman. Her father, a wealthy man with a rapidly shrinking bank account, was burning through what Marjorie considered her inheritance. She couldn't afford to wait for nature to take its course, so she enlisted Kenneth Barnes to take care of the problem. Kenneth agreed, but made it clear that he needed the money up front. And that, as they say, is the rub. With no money in hand, Marjorie had to get creative. Investigators believe Kenneth, who knew both Brian Wells and Marjorie, introduced the two. Whether Brian agreed to help or was dragged into it unwillingly remains a mystery. But soon enough, he was wearing a neck bomb, allegedly built by William, and heading into a bank. Witnesses later placed Brian at both Marjorie's and William's houses in the weeks leading up to the robbery. The theory goes that James Roden, Marjorie's boyfriend, got wind of the plot and realized it was doomed from the start. Maybe he even tried to warn Brian. If so, that sealed his fate. To protect her plan, and of course her inheritance, Marjorie allegedly killed James and stashed his body in William's freezer for safekeeping. The heist fell apart when Brian was stopped by the police, but the co-conspirators were temporarily off the hook thanks to Brian's death. That fragile safety net unraveled when William cracked and spilled the secrets to the investigators. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to see the case resolved, dying of cancer before the full story could come to light. That left Marjorie and Kenneth, the last two players standing. Kenneth took a plea deal, testifying against Marjorie, and both were convicted. William Rothstein and James Roden, both deceased, were posthumously implicated, which left just one name hanging in the air: Brian Wells. Was Brian a pawn, manipulated into this tragic end, or was he a willing participant who underestimated the people he'd teamed up with? The jury's still out. Authorities suspect Brian played some role, but with a key witness either dead or pointing fingers at each other, the truth may never fully be known. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and hey, if you're into unraveling mysteries that do not end with someone tragically meeting their demise, yeah, I know it's shocking, I do those too. Check out a brand new podcast that I've just created. It's called 10-Minute Mystery. It's like the sibling to this podcast, but with more conspiracy theories, more aliens, more missing people, more eyebrow-raising twists. Think strange disappearances, cryptic messages, and things that go bump in the night. It's the same brief and bingeable vibe, just a little less murdery. You'll love it, I think, so give it a listen. If you're already here, might as well keep the mystery train going. So check out 10-Minute Mystery. Wherever you're listening to this podcast right now, you can find it. In the best case scenario for me, you're subscribed and listen to both of the podcasts. Same overall kind of vibe, just completely different stories. And again, it's called 10-Minute Mystery. All right, that's going to do it. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast, 10-Minute Murder.